Rich man humiliates waitress in front of friends, only to regret it moments later. James Hawthorne sat at the corner of the lavish restaurant table, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the marble floor. The evening was well underway. His friends were laughing, sharing stories, and the clink of silverware against fine china echoed softly in the background. As always, James commanded the room effortlessly. Dressed in a sharp suit, he exuded confidence, his every move precise and deliberate, reflective of the world he had built for himself. He was the man everyone knew and admired, successful, rich, influential. His empire stretched across industries and he didn't hesitate to flaunt his wealth. Tonight was no different. His friends, a mix of business partners and old college buddies, were seated around the table, looking to James for validation as they laughed at his stories, drank their expensive wine, and basked in his presence. The waitress approached the table, a woman in her late 20s with a tired yet polite smile. She was dressed in a simple black dress and apron, moving swiftly between tables with practiced ease. James barely glanced up as she arrived, assuming she was just another part of the scenery, another person whose sole purpose was to cater to him and his guests. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything to drink?" Her voice was warm but professional, though James noticed the slight fatigue in her eyes. He smirked, looking her over with a quick, dismissive glance. "Water, I suppose?" he replied without much interest. "No, wait, bring me something with a bit more substance." His eyes shifted to the wine list on the table. "A bottle of your finest red. We're celebrating tonight." The waitress nodded without a word, turning to walk away, but James wasn't done. As she turned her back, he called out with a chuckle, "And make sure it's the best one. Don't want to be drinking something cheap." His friends laughed along with him, the sound of their amusement filling the room. The waitress, her back still to them, stiffened for just a moment before continuing her task. She had heard it all before, patrons making condescending comments or mocking her profession. But this somehow felt different. The audacity of James's comment, his entitlement, was palpable. She returned a few minutes later, placing the bottle of wine in front of him and uncorking it expertly. "Here you go, sir," she said, her tone professional but now with a slight edge. She poured a little into his glass, waiting for his approval. James swirled the wine in his glass before taking a sip, not bothering to thank her. He looked at his friends, his expression pleased. "Perfect," he said, nodding. "You can go now." The waitress gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh but didn't let it show. She stepped away, continuing her rounds with the other tables, but her hands were shaking slightly as she moved. The conversation shifted back to business as the evening wore on. James spoke about investments, new ventures, and his latest luxury acquisitions. His friends listened intently, occasionally chiming in with praise. He was in his element, speaking with the ease of a man who had always been able to dictate the terms of his world. As the waitress came back to refill his wine, James didn't even look up. "More," he said curtly, holding his glass out without a word. She poured the wine, her hands still slightly trembling. This time, however, she wasn't as quick to leave. Something about the way he was acting, the condescending tone, the dismissive air, had begun to wear on her. She dealt with worse, but this felt different. This wasn't just a casual insult. This was a deliberate attempt to make her feel small, as though she was nothing more than an accessory to his meal. As she finished pouring, James leaned back in his chair and looked up at her, his eyes narrowing as if sizing her up. "You know," he began, his voice deliberately loud enough for his friends to hear, "it's amusing how some people can spend their entire lives serving others. Doesn't it get tiring?" His friends, always eager to laugh at his jabs, chuckled along, some even looking at the waitress with a mix of pity and amusement. She could feel the eyes of the table on her now, and for a moment she hesitated. The sting of humiliation washed over her, but she swallowed it down. She'd had worse days, worse people to deal with. She wasn't going to let him see the effect he had on her. But her silence was only met with more comments from the group, all of them adding to the growing sense of discomfort that hovered in the air. James smiled at her, his expression one of smug superiority. "You really should find something else to do with your life. I mean, you're wasting your time here, don't you think?" There was a beat of silence in the room. The waitress stood still, her face impassive, but inside, her heart was pounding. She wanted to say something, anything, to stand up for herself. But she had learned long ago that words could sometimes be as sharp as knives, and she wasn't about to play into his game. Not in front of his friends. Instead, she gave a polite smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be right back with your dessert, sir," she said, her voice steady but taut with restraint. As she turned to walk away, James watched her retreating figure with a bemused look. "It's a shame, really," he said to his friends, his tone casual, as if the entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "She's probably a nice girl. Just in the wrong job." Laughter erupted from the table again, but this time, it sounded hollow to the waitress. She could hear them in the distance, but she didn't dare turn back. Instead, she walked swiftly toward the kitchen, clenching her fists to keep herself together. A few moments later, as she walked back to the table with their dessert orders, James's laughter still echoed in her ears. She placed the plates down in front of them with the same practiced professionalism, doing her best to ignore the eyes on her. As she turned to leave, James called out to her again, but this time his tone was different. There was something almost playful in it. "Hey, why don't you tell me what's it really like to work a job like this? You know, serving people like me?" She stopped, frozen for just a moment. She wanted to ignore him. She wanted to walk away, but something about his arrogance, his disregard, felt like a slap in the face. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. "It's just a job," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger that bubbled beneath the surface. "A job that helps me pay the bills. But I'm sure you've never had to worry about that, have you?" For a moment, James's smile faltered. His friends went silent, and he felt a flicker of discomfort run through him. There was something in her eyes, something that caught him off guard. It wasn't just that she had stood up for herself. It was the quiet dignity she held, despite everything he had said and done. He tried to laugh it off, but the words stuck in his throat. For the first time that night, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just a simple exchange anymore. She had shown him, in the most unexpected way, that she wasn't someone to be belittled. She turned to leave, but before she did, she added, "You should be careful, sir. Your words carry more weight than you think." At that moment, James felt a tightening in his chest. It wasn't from guilt, it was from the unexpected realization that something was off. His casual humiliation, the jokes at her expense, had felt harmless to him before. But now, the words echoed in his mind, louder and sharper than before. He glanced around the table at his friends, but the laughter had died down. There was an uncomfortable stillness in the air. His mind raced. What had just happened? Why did this feel so different than it had before? He was the one who always commanded respect, who always had the last word. But in that brief exchange, something had shifted. The waitress didn't just walk away. She had left him with something, an uncomfortable truth that he couldn't ignore. And as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for James. Though he tried to refocus on his friends and the conversation, his mind kept drifting back to the waitress. Her words echoed in his head, sharper than he expected. "Your words carry more weight than you think." He shifted in his chair, uncomfortably aware of how much space there was between him and the group. His friends, who had once seemed so amusing and reliable, now seemed almost distant to him. Their laughter felt like an echo in the background as his mind replayed that one simple yet powerful exchange. The rich man, who was so accustomed to controlling every room he entered, suddenly felt small. And it wasn't because of anything his friends had said. It was because of the strength in the waitress's voice. The way she didn't back down even when he tried to belittle her. It stuck with him. Back in the kitchen, the waitress, whose name James hadn't even bothered to ask, had retreated to a small corner where she could take a breath. Her heart was still pounding from the confrontation, but she knew she had done the right thing. It wasn't about winning the argument or getting back at him. It was about standing up for herself, showing that she was more than just someone who served meals for a living. As she leaned against the wall, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The long shifts, the constant pressure to perform, the rude customers, it was all wearing on her. But tonight something was different. The rich man's words had stung, but so had her own response. She hadn't meant to let her emotions show. But when she looked at him, sitting there so arrogantly, it was hard not to speak up. Her hands still felt a little shaky, but the anger was starting to fade. Instead, there was a small, quiet sense of pride in what she had done. She had kept her dignity intact. Meanwhile, James sat in silence, fidgeting with his wine glass. His friends were still talking, but the words didn't seem to register. He couldn't get the image of the waitress's face out of his mind, the calm, controlled way she'd handled the situation. He'd been expecting her to stutter or apologize, but instead, she had met his challenge head-on. A feeling of unease settled over him. What had just happened? Why did it bother him so much? He glanced at his watch and decided he needed a moment to clear his head. He stood up abruptly, excusing himself from the table. His friends barely acknowledged his departure, too engrossed in their own conversation to notice the shift in his mood. James made his way to the restrooms, but instead of turning left toward the hall, he found himself stepping outside into the cool night air. He needed to think. He needed to breathe. He hadn't been this unsettled in years. The outside world was quieter than the bustling restaurant. The city lights cast long shadows over the street, and the hum of traffic seemed distant. James leaned against the wall of the restaurant, staring into the distance, his mind racing. He was used to control. He was used to being the one people looked to for answers, for leadership. But that moment with the waitress, that tiny but powerful act of defiance, had thrown him off balance in a way he couldn't explain. He rubbed his temples, trying to push the feelings away. But they lingered. Her words, they kept coming back, haunting him. She had said that his words carried weight. And now he couldn't help but wonder, had he hurt her in ways he didn't understand? He could recall her face clearly now, how she had held her ground, even when everything inside her was likely telling her to retreat. And yet she hadn't. She had responded with quiet strength. Back inside, the waitress had finished her shift. She clocked out, grabbed her jacket, and headed for the door. She hadn't seen James again after the confrontation, but she could feel the weight of his words lingering in the air. She wasn't sure if he was going to confront her again, apologize, or just let it go. But she had already made her peace with the situation. She pushed open the door to the restaurant and stepped into the brisk night air, feeling the cool wind on her face. It was a small relief to escape the tension of the restaurant and the atmosphere inside. She knew she had done her best. She had stood up for herself when no one else would. As she walked down the street, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't turn around. She was used to the noise of the city, the clatter of people moving in all directions. But then, the footsteps stopped beside her, and she recognized the voice before she even turned. "Hey," James said, his voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" For a split second, she thought about ignoring him, continuing on her way. But something in the tone of his voice stopped her. He didn't sound like the arrogant man who had mocked her earlier. He sounded unsure, maybe even a little ashamed. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. "What's on your mind?" James took a deep breath, his hands in his pockets, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find the right words. I wanted to apologize for what I said earlier. I didn't mean to humiliate you." Her gaze softened slightly, but she didn't immediately respond. She had expected him to walk away, to dismiss the encounter entirely. But this was different. "You didn't have to apologize," she said, her voice steady. "But I appreciate it. I'm not someone who expects pity. I just wanted you to see that your words have an impact, whether you realize it or not." James nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He felt a weight lift from his chest as the moment stretched on. He had expected some form of hostility, maybe even anger. But instead, she had simply spoken the truth. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "I didn't realize how much weight my words carried. I thought I could just make a joke, but it wasn't funny." She nodded. "It's easy to forget that sometimes, but we're all human. And sometimes we need a reminder that our actions have consequences." James took a step closer, feeling the need to make things right. "If there's anything I can do, to make it up to you, I'd like to." She hesitated for a moment and then smiled, her eyes warm but guarded. "You don't need to do anything. Just be more mindful. That's all." James smiled back, feeling the sincerity of her words sink in. "I will. I promise." The air between them shifted as they both stood there, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The conversation had brought them to a place of mutual respect, and for the first time that evening, James felt like he could leave behind the arrogance that had clouded his actions earlier. "I'll let you go," he said, breaking the silence. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that I didn't mean what I said." The waitress nodded, her smile lingering. "It's okay. Have a good night." As she walked away, James watched her, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude and humility that he hadn't expected. He had learned something important tonight, something that would stay with him long after the evening was over. The moment was simple, but it marked a shift in both of their lives. The rich man, once so consumed with his own ego, had faced a moment of self-reflection. And the waitress, though initially humiliated, had shown her own strength and dignity. Together, they had navigated a brief but meaningful exchange that would change the way they saw each other, and themselves. The next few days after their encounter were a blur of conflicting emotions for James. He couldn't shake the moment he had shared with the waitress. Her words, her calm demeanor, her quiet strength, they lingered in his thoughts, resurfacing at odd times. When he sat in his office during meetings, when he spoke with his business partners, Even when he walked through the streets of the city, it was always there. The image of her standing on the street, her expression a mixture of resolve and grace, stuck with him. He had expected to walk away from the encounter feeling superior, his actions justified. But now, every time he thought about it, he felt a twinge of discomfort. What had he done? Why had he thought it was acceptable to treat her like that? James couldn't quite explain it. He had been arrogant, sure. He had made the joke, thinking it was harmless, but something about her quiet response, her refusal to let his words bring her down, had turned the tables. She had shown him, in that brief moment, that true dignity didn't require validation. She didn't need him to apologize or to make it right. She had simply owned her space, unshaken by his attempt to diminish her. It was a lesson that, for the first time, he truly understood. Back at the restaurant, the waitress, whose name was Emma, had already moved on. She wasn't dwelling on the encounter. Life had a way of moving quickly, and while James's words had stung, she had learned long ago not to let insults define her. But still, something about the apology had been different. Most people would have brushed it off, treated her with an air of condescension and acted as if they were doing her a favor. But James hadn't done that. His apology had felt genuine. He had acknowledged his mistake and she had felt no pressure to accept it, but simply to let him see it for what it was. Her shift the next day was the usual whirlwind of tables and orders, but her mind often drifted back to that brief encounter. She couldn't help but wonder what James had learned from their exchange, if he'd taken anything away from it. She didn't expect a grand gesture, nor did she want one. What mattered to her was the quiet, unspoken change, perhaps in herself but maybe, just maybe, in him. A week later, as Emma worked at the restaurant again, she noticed James walking through the front door with his usual confidence. But this time something was different. He wasn't accompanied by a group of friends or the usual entourage. He was alone. He approached the hostess asking for a table, and as he did, Emma happened to catch his eye. For a moment, their gazes locked across the room. James nodded slightly, his expression more subdued than she had ever seen it. Emma took a deep breath, but instead of feeling angry or defensive, she felt curious. When she was called to bring James his drink, she hesitated for a moment before walking toward him. As she neared the table, James stood up slightly, looking at her with a slight, apologetic smile. "Emma," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I hope you don't mind me coming here. I just wanted to thank you again for the other night." Emma, though she had expected this, wasn't quite sure how to respond. The encounter had passed, but hearing him speak those words again made her pause. She didn't let it show, but inside she appreciated the sincerity in his voice. "It's all right," she said with a soft nod. "No need to thank me. It was just a conversation." James smiled, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now. He wasn't trying to impress her, or make himself appear more important. He simply seemed more grounded. "I didn't realize how much my words could affect someone. And I think you were right. They carry weight." Emma looked at him for a moment, her expression neutral but thoughtful. She didn't want to make him feel like he was being condescended to, but she couldn't help herself. "People don't always realize that until they're on the receiving end of it," she said softly. "It's a hard lesson to learn." James nodded, his eyes softening. "I've had a lot of lessons like that lately." There was a pause between them. Emma noticed it, how different he seemed in this moment. There was no arrogance, no air of superiority. Just a man acknowledging his flaws and trying to be better. "I wanted to ask you something," James continued, his voice a little unsure. "Would you mind having dinner with me? I mean, outside of this place. I just want to talk. About life, about anything." Emma was taken aback for a moment. It wasn't uncommon for customers to try and charm the waitstaff, but this felt different. He wasn't offering her money or trying to impress her with his wealth. He was simply asking. She studied him for a moment, searching his face for any hint of pretense. But all she saw was sincerity. "You don't need to do that," she said, her voice quiet. "You've already said what needed to be said." James smiled again, though this time it was tinged with a little sadness. "Maybe. But I'd like to learn more. I'd like to understand." Emma paused, the warmth of the exchange not lost on her. Maybe she could afford to listen for once. Listen to someone who was genuinely trying to learn from his mistakes. "All right," she said after a beat, her tone measured but kind. "We can talk. But let's keep it simple." James's face lit up with a smile that seemed more genuine than anything he had given her earlier. "Of course. Simple sounds perfect." That evening they met at a quiet diner. The place wasn't fancy, but there was something comfortable about it. Nothing extravagant, just an ordinary place where ordinary people came to share a meal. James, for the first time in a long while, felt out of place in a way that was oddly humbling. Emma was already seated when he arrived. He walked in looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He was dressed casually, without the polished appearance of a man who was used to being in control. He sat down across from her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but instead felt like the calm before the storm of conversation they both knew was coming. "I never expected to be here, having dinner with someone I once humiliated," James said after a few moments, his voice low. Emma smiled gently, her eyes not unkind. "You're not the first person to make a mistake. And probably not the last." James let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "I used to think that power, money, success, those were the things that mattered. I thought they made me better. But I was wrong." Emma regarded him quietly, her gaze thoughtful. "It's easy to get lost in that. To think those things define who you are. But they don't. Your actions, how you treat others, that's what matters." James nodded. "I've realized that now. I've spent so long living with this armor around me, but it only isolated me from the people who mattered." Their conversation continued late into the night, both of them sharing stories of their lives. Emma spoke about her struggles, the challenges she faced, and the moments when she had to fight to keep her dignity. James listened attentively, his usual arrogance gone, replaced by a genuine curiosity and humility. By the end of the evening, neither of them had all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, James felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He hadn't come here to fix things but to understand. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was starting to. As Emma left the diner that night, she felt a quiet sense of resolution. She had never expected to see James again, let alone have a conversation like that. She didn't know what it meant for the future or if anything had truly changed. But for tonight, she was content with the knowledge that she had stood up for herself, and that he had listened. Following days were quieter for both James and Emma, though their lives had taken unexpected turns. For James, the world seemed slightly different, though he hadn't fully figured out why. He had been living a life of comfort and control, sure of himself, but something about the dinner with Emma had unsettled him. The way she had spoken, honestly, calmly, without pretense, had struck a chord within him. It wasn't just that she had stood up to him. It was the fact that she had done it without feeling the need to degrade him or seek retribution. Her dignity, her strength, had stayed with him long after they parted ways. His business meetings went smoothly, his usual sharp confidence intact, but underneath it all, he couldn't help but reflect on the simple conversation he'd had with Emma. Her words echoed in his mind: "Your actions, how you treat others, that's what matters." James had been so consumed by his career, by the drive to build more and more, that he had never really stopped to consider how he treated the people around him. His success, his wealth, had always given him a shield of sorts. He could get away with anything: jokes at the expense of others, sharp words, a dismissive glance. But now that shield felt like a weight on his shoulders. He was beginning to realize that he had been hiding behind it for far too long. Emma, on the other hand, had returned to her routine. Work was still demanding, and the restaurant remained a place where she saw the best and the worst of people. But since her dinner with James, something inside her had shifted as well. The encounter, though brief, had made her think about her own life, her own choices. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, taking whatever came her way, that she hadn't stopped to question how she was allowing people to treat her. She'd stood up to James that night, but in the days that followed, she realized that there were more moments like that in her life. More instances where she had simply accepted poor treatment without challenging it. Emma wasn't just a waitress. She was a person with her own dreams, her own story, and she didn't have to settle for being invisible. James's apology, though simple, had reminded her of her own strength. She could stand up for herself, and more than that, she could demand respect. It wasn't that she was bitter about her job. She liked it in its way. But she had spent too much time wondering if people like James ever saw her as more than just someone serving food. That night, she had decided that she wouldn't live in the shadows anymore. Whether James understood that or not, she had gained something from their exchange: a quiet resolve to never let someone diminish her again. Several weeks later, James found himself at a crossroads. He was sitting in a meeting with his business partners, going over the company's latest figures, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing at his phone, waiting for any excuse to check the time or make some small distraction. For the first time, he wasn't focused on the deal in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emma, the way she had held herself with such dignity, The way her voice had softened but her words had cut through him like a knife. James, one of his partners, Mark, interrupted his thoughts. "You've been awfully quiet today. Are we losing you?" James blinked, shaking himself from his reverie. "Sorry, just a little distracted." "What were we saying?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "I'm just asking about the expansion plan. The numbers are looking good, but we need your focus. You've got some big decisions to make." James took a deep breath. His mind wasn't on expansion plans or new deals. It was on something simpler. Something more profound. He hadn't expected it, but he realized that he wanted to understand people more. He wanted to see beyond their roles, beyond their professions, and understand them as people. Emma had given him that gift, whether she knew it or not. "Let's put a pause on this for a moment," James said, surprising everyone in the room. "I've been thinking. We need to do something different." His partners exchanged glances, clearly thrown off by his sudden shift in focus. Mark leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure yet," James admitted, "but I want to focus on something that matters. Something beyond just making more money. We've built the empire, but now, I want to see how we can impact the world around us. Not just in terms of charity, but in how we treat people." There was silence in the room as James's words hung in the air. His partners looked at him, uncertain, unsure how to respond. "You've got a point," Mark said slowly, "but you're talking about something completely different. Are you saying we put the business aside for what? Empathy?" James smiled, the weight of his realization still heavy on his shoulders. "I guess I am. Not aside exactly. But let's start by looking at things differently. I want to focus on people, not just profit. We're in a position where we can make a real difference. Let's use that power responsibly." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. James had already started looking into various local initiatives, charities, and social enterprises. He wasn't entirely sure how he would implement the changes he had in mind, but he knew it was the right step. He wasn't just thinking about a new business venture, he was thinking about leaving a legacy that mattered, one that transcended wealth and status. He reached out to a few organizations, asking questions, making inquiries. But it was more than just about giving away money, it was about creating sustainable impact. He knew that simply donating wasn't enough. He wanted to be involved. He wanted to understand what it took to make a real difference. One evening, as he sat at his desk looking over research on community projects, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma. "I've been thinking. We should talk again. There's a lot we can learn from each other." James smiled at the message. It wasn't an invitation for anything grand, just a simple request for conversation. But he understood now. It wasn't about impressing someone. It was about being open, about learning. He texted back quickly, his fingers moving with purpose. "I'd like that. Let's meet soon." The next week, they met again, this time at a small coffee shop, far from the glitz of high-end restaurants. The atmosphere was casual, but the conversation was anything but. They shared stories, talked about their respective journeys, and slowly the layers of their personalities began to unfold. For the first time in a long while, James didn't feel the pressure to be someone he wasn't. Emma spoke about her upbringing, her dreams, and the challenges of working in an environment where people like James often walked in and out of her life without ever really seeing her. James listened, not just with his ears but with his heart, learning what it meant to connect with someone as an equal, not as someone above them. And for Emma, she could feel the shift in him. The man she had met that night was different. There was no arrogance, no smugness. Just a person who was genuinely trying to learn, to grow. As the conversation wrapped up, Emma smiled at him. "You've changed, James?" "I hope so," he replied with a small, honest smile. "I've been learning." And for the first time, Emma felt like James wasn't just the wealthy businessman who had once looked down on her. He was someone who had truly started to see the world through a different lens. Someone who had begun to value the things that truly mattered. Over the next few weeks, James found himself spending more time outside of his usual business circles, meeting with local community leaders and organizations. He began immersing himself in projects that aimed to address social issues such as homelessness, poverty, and access to education. It wasn't just about throwing money at problems, it was about learning how to make a tangible, lasting impact. He didn't want to be just another billionaire who donated to causes for the sake of his image. He wanted to understand the root causes of the issues and help create sustainable solutions. As his involvement deepened, he found himself thinking back to Emma more and more. Her words and her ability to stand up to him had planted a seed in his mind. It wasn't just her strength that had impressed him, it was the way she handled the world with such grace, despite the difficult circumstances she faced. She was someone who had learned to thrive in an environment that many would have crumbled under. She had, in many ways, become the embodiment of everything he wanted to be. Someone who was grounded, authentic, and who gave back. Though their meetings had been brief and infrequent, James had already come to admire her more than he cared to admit. They had continued their conversations, each time delving deeper into their respective lives. It wasn't just small talk anymore. They were opening up to each other in a way that felt genuine, sharing frustrations, dreams, and even vulnerabilities. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day spent touring local shelters and food banks, James sat in his office, reviewing the information he had gathered. The research was overwhelming, but for the first time he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just building an empire anymore. He was building a platform for change, for real social good. His phone buzzed and he saw a message from Emma. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you said. There's still so much we could do to make this work. Are you free for dinner tomorrow?" James smiled at the message. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and he was eager to hear her thoughts. Not just about the foundation he was working on, but about how they both could continue to learn from one another. He had found in her a kindred spirit, someone who saw the world differently but who shared his desire to make it better. "Dinner sounds great. I'll pick you up at 7, he texted back. "Sounds perfect." The following evening they met at a cozy restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a quiet spot that allowed for easy conversation. James had chosen the place, trying to keep things simple and comfortable, in line with the new direction his life was taking. As Emma sat down across from him, she noticed the change in James. He wasn't wearing his usual expensive suit or flashy watch. Instead, he was dressed casually, with an easygoing demeanor that made him seem more like a regular person. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes. "So, how's the foundation going?" Emma asked after they had exchanged greetings. She had been following his progress with genuine interest. She had never imagined she would find herself talking to a wealthy businessman about social issues, but with James, it felt natural. She had always believed that people from all walks of life could come together to create change, and here in this conversation was living proof of that. James leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "It's going well. Better than I expected, actually. We've already partnered with a few local shelters and educational programs. We're focusing on long-term solutions now, not just short-term fixes. We're working on providing job training, education, and housing support to those who need it the most." Emma's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That's incredible. I'm glad to hear it. It's exactly the kind of approach that will make a real difference." James nodded, but there was a trace of doubt in his expression. It's hard to know if we're doing enough. I want to make sure that what we're doing will last, that we're not just throwing money at problems and hoping they disappear." Emma's tone softened, understanding the weight of his words. "It's always going to feel like there's more to do. But as long as you're committed to learning, to understanding the issues deeply, that's where real change starts. It's not about the size of the donation. It's about showing up time and time again." James paused, taking in her words. She was right, of course. He had been so focused on making a tangible impact that he hadn't always considered the quieter, more consistent work that was necessary to see change through. It was about commitment to the long haul, to the people whose lives were being shaped by the work he was doing. And it was about understanding that real change wasn't always visible at first. "I've been learning a lot," James admitted, his voice thoughtful. "And I've realized that there's a lot I still don't understand. I want to be a part of the solution, but sometimes I feel like I'm just scratching the surface." Emma smiled gently, reaching for her drink. "That's the first step. Realizing that you don't know everything. You're going in the right direction, James. And the fact that you're asking the right questions, that's more important than you know." Their conversation flowed easily after that, covering everything from their personal lives to the broader scope of social change. As they shared more, the connection between them deepened. They were no longer just two people discussing the world. They were two people with shared goals, with a common understanding of the importance of empathy, respect, and action. Over the following months, James and Emma continued their partnership, both in their professional endeavors and their growing friendship. James kept moving forward with his foundation, now much more focused on the human side of things. He had realized that wealth could open doors, but it was his actions, his willingness to learn, and his connection to people like Emma that would allow him to truly make a difference. Emma, meanwhile, found herself becoming more involved in the projects James was working on. What had started as a simple dinner conversation had now grown into a shared mission. She used her own experiences and knowledge to guide him, offering insight from the ground level, where the problems were most pressing. As they spent more time together, they became a team, not just in the foundation's work but in life. They supported each other's goals, each learning from the other and growing together. It wasn't about changing the world overnight, but it was about making consistent, meaningful change. James had learned that the value of wealth was not in what it could buy, but in how it could be used to lift others. And Emma had learned that standing up for herself and her beliefs could ripple out into something far greater than she had imagined. One day, as they sat together in James's office, looking over progress reports and planning their next steps, James turned to Emma with a soft smile. "I never expected all of this. To be sitting here doing this. It's changed everything for me." Emma smiled back, her eyes warm. "Sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them." James nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I'm grateful for everything. For you. For showing me that there's more to life than just building an empire." Emma paused for a moment, then spoke with quiet sincerity. "You've always had the potential to make a real impact, James. But now you're doing it in a way that actually matters. And that's something I admire." James felt a wave of warmth spread through him. It wasn't just her words, it was her belief in him, her understanding of what had driven him to change. They had both found a sense of purpose, not in power or wealth, but in their shared mission to create real, lasting change. As they sat there, planning the future of the foundation, they knew that they had already made a difference in each other's lives. And that was just the beginning. As the months passed, the foundation continued to flourish. James and Emma worked tirelessly, side by side, refining their approach, seeking out new opportunities, and staying true to the original mission they had set. The focus remained on building lasting, sustainable change, changing people's lives one step at a time. James had become a different man than he was when they first met. No longer driven solely by the pursuit of power, he had found fulfillment in something deeper, more meaningful. He had learned that success wasn't defined by the size of one's bank account or the amount of influence one held. It was measured in the lives impacted, in the dignity restored, and in the relationships formed. Every time he walked into a community center or a shelter, meeting the people whose lives were being transformed, he felt a sense of pride and purpose he'd never experienced before. It was no longer just about the money, it was about the people. The laughter of children at after-school programs, the gratitude of families finding stable housing, and the stories of resilience he heard every day reminded him of why he was doing this work. The richness of these moments, the connections he formed, had become his new measure of success. And then there was Emma. Their partnership had grown stronger with every passing day. What began as a simple dinner conversation had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Emma had become not just a collaborator but a true equal, someone who kept James grounded while also inspiring him to reach further than he thought possible. The bond they had formed wasn't just about working together, it was about mutual respect, admiration, and understanding. Emma had seen something in James that few others had. She had seen beyond his wealth, beyond the surface arrogance, to the person underneath who was capable of great change. And he had seen in her a quiet strength and wisdom that guided him as he navigated this new path. As they spent more time together, their conversations moved beyond business. They discussed their hopes, their fears, and the world they wanted to create. They talked about the future, not just of the foundation but of their own lives. Their relationship had evolved from professional partners to friends, and then to something deeper, something neither of them had fully expected. James, once so focused on building his empire, had found something far more valuable, a connection that wasn't based on power but on shared values. Emma had opened up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. She saw in him the potential to be better, and he saw in her someone who had always been better than she gave herself credit for. One afternoon, as they sat together in the Foundation's new community center, looking out over the bustling streets outside, James spoke quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I never thought I'd be here doing this. This work, this life, it's changed me in ways I didn't even know were possible." Emma turned toward him, her eyes soft. "You've changed, James. I've seen it. But it's not just about the foundation. It's about how you see the world now. You don't just look at people as projects to fix anymore. You see them as human beings. And that's something special." James smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "I owe that to you. You were the one who made me realize it, who opened my eyes to what really matters. You showed me that the only way to truly help people is to see them, not as problems to solve, but as equals, as people worthy of dignity and respect." Emma's heart swelled at his words. She hadn't expected such acknowledgement, but it meant more than she could express. She had never sought to change him, but in some ways she had. And in the process she had changed herself too. Together, they had become more than just two individuals working side by side, they had become partners in every sense of the word. As they sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experience sinking in, Emma spoke again. "James, do you ever think about the future? I mean, beyond the foundation?" He looked at her, the question hanging in the air for a beat. "I do. I think about what we've built, about how much more we can do together. The work we're doing is important, but I don't want to lose sight of the people who matter most along the way. I want to make sure we're living this life fully, together." Emma smiled softly, a sense of peace settling over her. "Together," she repeated, her heart swelling with something that wasn't just about professional success, but about shared dreams. The future was no longer just about chasing something elusive or material. It was about building something that lasted, a legacy that wasn't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the lives they had touched, the people they had helped, and the bond they had created. One evening, as they walked through a local park after a long day of meetings, James reached for Emma's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound. They had spent so much time focused on changing the world, on making an impact, that they had forgotten the beauty in the small moments. Emma squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of the connection between them. "I never imagined this would be my life," she said softly, looking up at the stars that began to twinkle above them. "I never imagined I'd be here with you doing this." James smiled down at her, his heart full. "I never imagined it either. But I'm glad it's happening. I'm glad it's with you." They walked together in silence, the peaceful sounds of the night surrounding them. It was clear now that this wasn't just a professional partnership. It was a shared journey, a journey that had begun with one act of kindness, one moment of humility, and one powerful decision to see the world differently. And as they continued to walk side by side, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Not as the rich man and the waitress, but as two people who had found something real, something that could change everything.